Hello and welcome. Tonight, we step into the last winter of the Second World War. By December of 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be reaching its conclusion. Nazi Germany had been battered, driven back across its borders, cities smoldered in ruins, allies were gone, resources drained. Yet in desperation, the Reich reached for one final strike. A gamble meant to shatter the Allies, divide their armies, and rewrite the ending of the war. This gamble would unfold not in grand capitals or on open plains, but in the hushed, snowbound forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, a place where stillness lingered, where rivers flowed slow beneath sheets of ice, where the silence of winter disguised the gathering storm. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge, but before the thunder came, there was quiet, a quiet that felt eternal. The Ardennes in December was a land wrapped in frost. Rolling hills stretched outward, covered in thick forests of pine and oak. The branches sagged under the weight of snow, bowing low as if burdened by the weight of history itself. The roads wound through valleys and over ridges, their surfaces slick with ice, their paths hidden beneath white drifts. Villages dotted the landscape, their rooftops softened by snow, their windows glowing faintly with the light of lanterns and hearths. Smoke curled upward from chimneys, dissolving into grey skies. At first glance, it was a peaceful scene, as though untouched by war. But peace was an illusion. Beneath the quiet surface, the land was heavy with waiting. For the Allied soldiers sent to this sector, the Ardennes was supposed to be a place of rest. They had fought through Normandy's hedgerows, across the fields of France, into towns shattered by artillery. They had seen comrades fall, had endured long marches and endless fighting. The Ardennes was different. Their commanders considered it a quiet sector, safe enough to rotate entire divisions. Here the men could recover, reorganize, and prepare for the push into Germany. And so the soldiers settled into the rhythms of winter. They slept in barns, sharing straw and blankets to keep away the bitter chill. They dug foxholes in frozen earth, lining them with pine boughs, laying planks across the top to shield from snow. They built small fires, their smoke rising faintly through cracks in the cover. Helmets rested on the edges of trenches, their surfaces gathering frost. Rifles lay close at hand, their metal cold to the touch, their barrels wrapped in rags to keep out ice. The days moved slowly. Men passed the hours with cards and dice, their laughter echoing faintly in the still air. They swapped cigarettes, traded bits of chocolate, and shared jokes too tired to be funny, but welcome all the same. Coffee boiled in tin mugs, its bitter steam curling into the cold. In the evenings, some men wrote letters home, their words cramped on paper, their sentences filled with longing. They wrote of Christmas approaching, of the hope that this winter might be the last they spent away, of dreams of warm kitchens and the sound of familiar voices. Those letters traveled across the ocean. In America, families gathered around kitchen tables, tearing open envelopes, reading each word carefully, clinging to them as if they might carry the presence of their sons and husbands across the miles. Mothers lit candles in windows, hoping they might guide their boys back home. Wives and sweethearts pressed the paper to their lips, breathing in the faint smell of smoke, of pine, of a foreign winter. Children asked when their fathers would return, their questions answered with careful smiles, with promises that the war would soon be done. It seemed possible. The war did feel close to ending. Paris was free. The Allies had crossed France in a tide of steel and men. The German army had been pushed back to its borders. Victory seemed within sight. And so in December, with Christmas near, soldiers and families alike allowed themselves to hope. But far to the east in Berlin, another story was being written. Hitler demanded one last offensive. His generals laid out maps, tracing bold arrows through the Ardennes. The plan was daring. Strike through the quiet forest, smash through the thin American lines, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. Britain and America would be forced apart, supply lines severed, unity broken. Perhaps then, Germany might bargain. Perhaps then, defeat could be delayed. It was a plan born not of strength, but of desperation. The Reich had little fuel, few reserves, and no allies left. Yet still the orders came, and in the forests opposite the resting Americans, the Germans prepared. Columns of tanks rolled quietly down narrow roads, their tracks muffled by snow. Trucks carried ammunition and men, headlights covered, engines muted. Soldiers wrapped scarves around their faces, their breath visible in the cold. They huddled in silence, clutching rifles, waiting for orders. Some were veterans hardened by years of war. Others were boys, barely older than those they would soon face. They were told this offensive would change everything, that it would break the enemy, restore hope, and turn back the tide. For some, it was enough to believe. For others, it was just another command in a war that had already taken too much. The Ardennes became a place of mirrors. On one side, men at rest, believing themselves safe. On the other, men preparing to strike, believing they could still win. Between them lay only the snow, the trees, and the silence. That silence was profound. At night, the forest seemed to sleep. The moon cast pale light across the hills, turning the snow silver. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faint creak of trees. In distant valleys, dogs barked, their voices echoing into the night. A church bell rang the hour, the sound carrying through frozen air, then fading into nothing. For the men in the foxholes, silence was both comfort and curse. It meant no attack, no sudden alarm, but it also meant time to think. Young Americans, barely out of school, rubbed their hands for warmth and imagined porches back home, imagined stockings hung by fireplaces, imagined the smell of bread in kitchens. German soldiers, older, more weary, stared into the darkness and wondered if this gamble would be their end. Families far away sat in warm houses, their prayers rising into the night, hoping those prayers might cross the ocean, cross the snow, and reach the men who needed them most. The land itself seemed to wait. Rivers flowed sluggishly, ice spreading across their surfaces. Fields lay empty, covered in frost, their furrows hidden beneath drifts. Trees swayed gently, shedding flakes that drifted like dust in the air. Villages slept, their streets empty but for footprints, their lamps flickering in windows. The Ardennes was beautiful, but it was not peaceful. It was suspended, paused, holding its breath. The soldiers who played cards, who sipped bitter coffee, who wrote letters home, they did not yet know what was coming. The commanders who thought they had found a quiet sector to rest did not realize they had placed their men in the path of a storm. The families who prayed in warm kitchens, who lit candles against the dark, could not know that this winter would bring one of the cruelest chapters of the war. The Ardennes was quiet, snowbound, deceptively calm, and in that calm, history itself waited. The silence of December 1944 was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before the storm. A silence that history would never forget. The war should have been over. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was shattered. Cities burned, its armies battered, its skies dominated by Allied bombers. On every front, the Reich was losing ground. To the east, the Red Army was sweeping westward, relentless and unbroken. To the west, the Americans, the British, and their allies were pressing deeper into Germany itself. Supplies were scarce, fuel was nearly gone, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had been drained of men and machines. By all logic, the end was inevitable. But logic is not what guided Adolf Hitler in the final year of his rule. Pride, desperation, and delusion carried more weight than reason. And in that desperation, in the fading winter of 1944, Hitler devised one last gamble. The gamble was simple in concept, yet staggering in ambition. Launch a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. Break through the thin American lines, sweep across Belgium, and capture the port city of Antwerp. If successful, This single move would split the Allied armies in two. The British to the north, the Americans to the south. Supplies cut, communication shattered, unity destroyed. In the chaos, perhaps Germany could negotiate peace. Perhaps Hitler could force the Allies to the table. Perhaps the war, which should have ended, could be dragged out into something else entirely. It was not just strategy, it was defiance. Hitler refused to accept defeat even as reality pressed in on all sides. His empire was collapsing, but in the quiet halls of his command he drew bold arrows across maps, arrows that reached toward Antwerp, arrows that promised redemption. He believed the West was fragile, that the Americans, untested compared to his veterans, would break under pressure, that the British, weary of years of war, would retreat rather than fight. He believed winter itself would be his ally, that snow, cold, and clouded skies would ground the Allied air power and conceal his forces. It was, in truth, a dream. But dreams in desperate hands can be dangerous. The plan was drawn in secrecy. Hitler trusted few, and his generals whispered doubts behind closed doors. Some argued the offensive was impossible. Germany had neither the fuel nor the manpower. Tanks without fuel were useless. Soldiers without supplies were doomed. But Hitler silenced dissent. He insisted the attack would succeed not because the Reich had strength, but because its enemies had weakness. And so even generals who doubted obeyed. They sharpened their plans, moved their units, and prayed that somehow impossibility could be turned into victory. Across Germany, orders went out. Tanks were pulled from storage, repaired hastily, painted with winter camouflage. Trucks rumbled down frozen roads, headlights dark, carrying ammunition and rations. Soldiers were gathered, many too young or too old. Some convalescents pulled from hospitals, others veterans pulled from every remaining corner of the front. They were told this would be decisive. This was their chance to change everything. Propaganda spread the message. The Reich was wounded, yes, but not broken. One more strike, one last push, and the enemy would crumble. Among the soldiers, belief was mixed. Some clung to the words, convincing themselves that this attack might deliver them home. Others marched in silence, carrying their rifles through snow, too weary to believe anything but orders. They passed through villages where civilians looked on with hollow eyes. Towns had been stripped bare. Food and supplies seized to feed the army. Women and children stood in doorways, watching columns of gray uniforms move toward the west, toward the forest, toward the silence where the Allies waited. Fuel was hoarded for the panzers. Every drop mattered. Trucks were parked and hidden, tanks camouflaged beneath trees, their engines silent until the moment came. Secrecy was everything. If the Allies discovered the plan too early, the offensive would die before it began. And so deception was woven into every move. German troops disguised themselves as Americans, dressed in stolen uniforms, carrying fake orders. Bridges were rebuilt at night, roads repaired in darkness, maps marked with careful precision. The Germans called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. To the Allies it would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. In Hitler's mind, it was not just a military strike. It was revenge. Revenge for the bombing of German cities. Revenge for the humiliation of retreat. Revenge for the defeats that had stained the Reich. He wanted to show the world that Germany could still strike with power, still terrify its enemies, still bend the course of history with steel and blood. And yet beneath all the bravado, reality could not be hidden. The Reich was exhausted. Industry was crumbling. The Luftwaffe, once feared, was a shadow. The railways struggled to deliver supplies. Men marched with mismatched uniforms, boots falling apart, rifles older than themselves. Tanks were powerful, but there were not enough of them. Fuel was rationed, ammunition stretched thin. The army that once swept across Europe was now patchwork, stitched together from what scraps remained. But still they prepared. In the forests of Western Germany, camps filled with men waiting for orders. They huddled around fires, their faces pale in the glow, their breath curling into the air. They whispered about Antwerp, about how far it was, about whether the Allies would break. Some laughed, nervous and sharp. Others fell silent, staring into the flames. Officers barked commands, drilling them in the dark. The sound of boots crunching on snow echoed between the trees. Secrecy extended even to their own ranks. Many soldiers were not told the full plan. They were told only that a great attack was coming, that victory was possible if they fought with everything they had left. Maps were shared with only a few, orders given at the last possible moment. The attack would come suddenly, brutally, and without warning. The Ardennes had been chosen for a reason. It was quiet. The Allies considered it a resting ground, a sector so calm they sent weary divisions to recuperate. The terrain was difficult, thick forests, winding roads, steep hills, but it was precisely this difficulty that made it ideal. The Allies would never expect a massive armored assault here. Hitler believed surprise would be total. He believed his enemies would be caught sleeping. And so the wounded giant readied its strike. In bunkers and command posts, German generals bent over maps, their fingers tracing lines through valleys and over rivers. They knew the risks. They knew the plan depended on speed, on fuel, on weather. If the skies cleared, the Allies would unleash their bombers. If the advance slowed, supplies would vanish. If Antwerp could not be reached quickly, the offensive would collapse. And yet they obeyed, not because they believed it would work, but because they had no choice. Defiance was their only currency left. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence saw pieces, but not the whole. Patrols noticed more German activity, whispers of movement, signs of build-up. But winter bred caution. Snow, muffled sound, obscured vision, concealed roads. Commanders dismissed the possibility of a major offensive. After all, the Germans were beaten. They had no strength for such a gamble. The forest seemed too quiet, too still, too safe. That miscalculation would soon cost dearly. For now, though, December remained frozen. On one side, American soldiers resting, writing letters, playing cards, their rifles stacked neatly by the door of a barn. On the other, German soldiers preparing for an impossible dream, checking their weapons, whispering into the night. Between them lay snow, silence, and the promise of violence. The Reich was a wounded giant, staggering, bleeding, yet still dangerous, and in its pain it chose to strike. The gamble was set, the arrows were drawn, the dream of Antwerp shimmered like frost in the dark. This was not the story of conquest. It was not the story of a great army marching with strength and certainty. It was the story of exhaustion, of defiance, of a nation that could not accept defeat, even as defeat pressed in on every side. In December 1944, Hitler's last gamble was about to begin. And the world would soon learn how much destruction a dying empire could still unleash. December 16, 1944. The silence shattered. For weeks, the Ardennes had been quiet, a white cathedral of snow and pine. Soldiers on both sides thought it was a resting ground, a place where the war seemed far away, but in the early morning hours that illusion ended. The ground shook first. At 5:30 in the morning, across 80 miles of front, more than 1,000 German guns opened fire. Artillery thundered through the stillness. Trees splintered, earth erupted, villages crumbled under the roar. The shells came in endless waves, ripping through barns, homes, and foxholes. Men who had been sleeping minutes before now clutched their helmets, crawling into frozen soil, praying to survive the storm. The forest amplified the chaos. Sound bounced between the trunks, echoing and multiplying until it felt like the earth itself was collapsing. Snow fell from the branches with every explosion, clouds of white mixing with smoke and dirt. The air was filled with fragments of wood, stone, and steel. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the sky glowed red with fire. Fog clung to the valleys, rolling like a curtain drawn over the stage. Visibility vanished. The world shrank to a few yards where shapes blurred into shadows. In that fog, German soldiers advanced. Entire divisions slipped forward beneath the cover, their boots crunching softly in the snow, their tanks growling low as if muted by the mist. The Ardennes became a maze, its narrow roads and frozen fields now choked with steel and men. Villages, once quiet refuges, became battlefields in minutes. Small towns like Losheimergraben, Krinkelt and Honsfeld woke to the sound of walls collapsing, streets cracking under the weight of tanks. Civilians scrambled for cellars, clutching children, dragging what little they could carry. Fires spread quickly in the wooden houses, casting orange light against the pale fog. Families prayed as artillery screamed overhead, the ground around them trembling with every detonation. For the soldiers stationed there, it was chaos unlike anything they had known. Many were inexperienced Americans sent to the Ardennes because commanders thought it was a quiet sector. These were men who had just weeks earlier believed they were safe. Now they found themselves caught in a nightmare. Ordinary men awakened to extraordinary war. Some never made it out of their bunks. Shells tore through barracks, wood and metal collapsing onto bodies. Others stumbled half-dressed into the snow, grabbing rifles, not even sure where the enemy was. Confusion reigned. Officers scrambled for orders, but radios failed, lines were cut, messages lost in the storm of fire. In the fog, it was impossible to know friend from foe. The German assault came like a tidal wave. Infantry swept through woods and fields, their advance masked by fog and artillery. Tanks pressed along narrow roads, their tracks grinding ice into mud. At crossroads and bridges, firefights erupted suddenly, close, brutal, and short. American positions crumbled under the weight. Some units fought desperately, firing until their rifles jammed, throwing grenades until their belts were empty. Others were overwhelmed, captured, or scattered, fleeing into the trees to regroup. The Ardennes forest itself became both ally and enemy. For the Germans, its cover was protection, hiding columns of men and tanks from Allied eyes. Fog and trees concealed their movements, giving the illusion of ghosts materializing from nowhere. But for the same reason, it slowed their advance. Tanks struggled on icy roads, trucks clogged narrow passes, supply lines stretched thin. What gave them surprise also threatened to trap them in their own momentum. For the Americans, the forest was a cruel friend. It gave some units shelter, places to hide and regroup. Trees shielded them from direct fire, offered cover in the chaos. But the same forest isolated them, cut them off from each other, left them blind to the bigger picture. A platoon might fight bravely in one grove of pines, not knowing the enemy had already broken through just a mile away. The fog thickened, turning battles into nightmares. Imagine fighting an enemy you cannot see until he is only steps away. Shapes emerging from the white, rifles firing at flashes, voices shouting in languages that echo strangely in the mist. At times, men fired blindly, terrified of the unseen. Stories spread of Germans disguised in American uniforms, spreading confusion, giving false orders. Paranoia grew. In the haze, anyone could be friend or foe. Villages bore the worst of it. In small towns scattered across the Ardennes, people woke to war exploding in their doorways. Shops, churches, and schools became ruins in hours. Streets ran with mud and blood, filled with the groans of the wounded. Tanks pushed through houses, walls collapsing under treads. Families huddled in basements, listening to boots stomping above, praying the fighting would pass them by. The offensive was massive, but it was not clean. Roads clogged quickly. German columns stretched for miles, vehicles jammed bumper to bumper, engines sputtering in the cold. Horses pulled wagons when fuel ran out, their hooves slipping on ice, yet still they came, wave after wave, filling the forest with movement. For the Americans, the first hours were disorientation. Men who thought they were in a quiet sector now found themselves surrounded. Some units were obliterated before they could respond. Others fell back, fighting desperate rearguard actions to slow the tide. Stories emerged of isolated groups holding crossroads, barns, or bridges for hours longer than expected, their resistance buying precious time. But time was running fast. German units moved with urgency, determined to seize ground before the fog lifted, before the skies cleared and Allied planes returned. Every mile mattered, every crossroads a prize. Battles raged in farmyards, in forests, in frozen fields. Rifle fire cracked, machine guns rattled, mortars thumped, and above it all, artillery never ceased. In the midst of it, ordinary men tried to make sense of the extraordinary. Soldiers wrote quick notes in small notebooks, words that might be their last. Some prayed, others cursed. Many simply fought because there was no other choice. Civilians, too, found themselves swept into the storm. Farmers watched their land churned into trenches and craters. Children clutched their mothers as tanks rumbled past. For them, there was no strategy, no grand plan, only survival. The forest became a living thing. Snow muffled sound, then carried it strangely, so gunfire seemed both near and far. Branches snapped under the weight of ice, echoing like rifle shots. Smoke hung low between the trunks, mixing with mist until the air itself seemed thick with war. In those woods, men felt small, lost, consumed by forces larger than themselves. And still, the Germans pressed on. Their orders were clear. Break through, push west, reach the Meuse, and beyond it, Antwerp. Every step forward brought them closer, but every step also drained their strength. Fuel ran low, supplies lagged behind, roads jammed with wrecks. Yet in those first days, the offensive was unstoppable. Surprise was complete, confusion total. The Allies reeled, their lines bent and buckled under the pressure. But the Ardennes was no open plain. Every advance met resistance. At crossroads, small American units dug in, refusing to yield. In towns, snipers fired from windows, machine guns rattled from basements. These small stands slowed the German tide, even as they were swallowed by it. Each pocket of resistance bought minutes, sometimes hours, and in war, time can be more valuable than armies. Through it all, the fog lingered. It dulled the sun, muted colors turned the world gray. Men stumbled through it, their breath mingling with the mist, their eyes straining for shapes. The forest became a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, a place where death came suddenly, often unseen. By night, the chaos deepened. Fires burned in villages, casting flickering light against the dark trees. Artillery flashes lit the horizon like lightning storms. Men slept, if they slept at all, in snow-filled foxholes, their bodies shaking from cold and fear. In the dark, the forest whispered creaks, snaps, and distant movement, each sound sharpening nerves already stretched thin. This was the opening of the Battle of the Bulge. Not a clash of generals in distant rooms, but of men caught in the fog and fire of a winter forest. Villages burned, armies clashed, and the world tilted into chaos. The Ardennes had seemed quiet, almost forgotten. But in December of 1944, it became a stage for one of the war's most brutal surprises. The pines stood tall, indifferent, their branches heavy with snow. Beneath them, men fought and bled, their stories written in ice and smoke. The forest was both ally and enemy. It gave cover, but it gave confusion. It hid movements, but it hid dangers. It sheltered men, but it swallowed them too. Through the pines and shadows, the battle raged on, and the silence of winter was replaced with the roar of war. Bastogne. A quiet market town in the Ardennes, nestled among rolling hills and pine forests. Before the war, it was known for its cattle markets, its cobbled streets, its modest square where people gathered on Sundays, a place of farmers, shopkeepers, and children walking to school in the crisp morning air. Ordinary, almost forgettable. But in the winter of 1944, Bastogne became something else. It became a name carved into the memory of resistance. The German offensive swept like fire through the Ardennes. Villages crumbled, crossroads fell, American lines bent backwards under the weight of tanks and artillery. Everywhere, retreat and confusion, but Bastogne was different. Bastogne was a prize. It sat at the center of a web of roads, 7 in all, that led outward in every direction. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the region. For the Germans, capturing it meant keeping their offensive alive. For the Americans, holding it meant stopping the advance. Into this storm came the 101st Airborne Division. They were not fully supplied, not fully rested, and not fully ready. They had been pulled from the north, rushed by truck and on foot, thrown into the defense with little preparation. Many arrived with no winter clothing. Some carried only the ammunition they had in their belts. The cold bit through their thin uniforms. The snow reached their boots. Their rifles froze if not cared for constantly, but they dug in. They had no choice. By December 19th, the German ring had closed. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st, along with elements of tanks, artillery, and engineers, were cut off. No roads in, no roads out. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition grew scarce. Food ran out. Wounded piled in makeshift hospitals. Churches, schools, barns converted into wards. The cold seeped into every wall. Doctors worked with little medicine, sometimes no anesthetic, their breath visible in the freezing air as they cut and stitched. Yet the defenders held. Every road leading to Bastogne became a battlefield. German tanks rumbled forward only to be stopped by bazooka teams hidden in the snow. Infantry launched assaults only to be driven back by machine gun nests dug into frozen foxholes. The forest around Bastogne became a wall of fire and ice, where men fought at distances so close they could hear each other's breath. The siege was relentless. Day after day the Germans pressed in, and day after day the defenders refused to break. They held crossroads, they held ridges, they held ruined farms. Sometimes they lost ground, sometimes they retook it, but always they fought. For the men inside, survival depended not just on bullets, but on will. In the center of town, in a basement headquarters beneath a cafe, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the defense. He was calm, even cheerful despite the chaos above. His men respected him for it. They needed that steadiness because outside the situation grew worse by the hour. Shells rained down daily. Supplies never arrived. Snow fell endlessly, blanketing trenches, freezing rifles solid, turning boots to blocks of ice. Hunger gnawed constantly. Soldiers boiled snow for water, chewed whatever scraps they could find. Some ate roots dug from frozen earth. Others split rations so thin they barely tasted food at all. It was under these conditions that one of the war's most famous exchanges took place. On December 22nd, 2 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a message. The town, they said, was surrounded. The German commander demanded surrender to avoid further bloodshed. He offered honorable terms if the Americans laid down their arms. The message was delivered to McAuliffe. He read it and laughed. Then he scribbled a single word on the reply. Nuts. The German envoys were confused. They asked for clarification. What did nuts mean? The American officer delivering the reply explained plainly, it means go to hell. The word spread quickly through the 101st. Soldiers repeated it with grins, their morale lifted. In the face of hunger, cold, and encirclement, nuts became a banner of defiance. It was not long speeches, not great declarations, but a single word that captured their spirit. Surrounded, starving, bombarded, they would not surrender. The Germans pressed harder after that. Tanks tried to force their way in from the north, the south, the east, the west. Artillery rained down, turning the town into rubble. Planes strafed when weather allowed. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching their children as buildings shook. Wounded soldiers moaned in overcrowded hospitals, blankets pulled tight against the cold, but still the defenders held. Foxholes became graves and shelters alike. Men lived knee-deep in frozen mud, their boots stiff, their hands cracked and bleeding, frostbite blackened toes and fingers. Yet they stayed in their holes, rifles clutched, eyes straining through the snow for the next attack. Nights were the hardest. The temperature dropped below freezing, sometimes far lower. Blankets were few, coats scarce, fires dangerous because they drew artillery. Men shivered until their teeth rattled, prayed until their voices cracked, but did not abandon their posts. The forest around Bastogne echoed with constant war. Machine guns chattered, mortars thumped, shells shrieked overhead, trees splintered under fire, their trunks scarred with shrapnel, snow turned black with soot, red with blood. The line bent, it stretched, but it never broke. For every attack there was an answer, for every push there was resistance. The 101st Airborne, engineers, tankers, artillerymen, clerks, cooks all fought together to hold the town. Civilians too endured. Families sheltered in basements with soldiers, sharing what little food remained. Mothers soothed crying children as bombs fell. Fathers cleared rubble to create space for the wounded. In one church-turned-hospital, stained glass shattered while inside, doctors worked by candlelight, surrounded by rows of stretchers. They had almost no medicine left. They improvised with what they had. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then rose to work again. For the Germans, Bastogne was a thorn. Every day it remained in American hands was another day their timetable slipped. They needed those roads, they needed that hub. They hurled division after division at it, but the town held. It was as if the will of a few thousand men outweighed the plans of an empire. By Christmas, the defenders were still surrounded. Snow fell thick, covering wrecks of tanks, corpses of men, ruins of homes. In the town square, a small group of soldiers and civilians held a makeshift service, voices rising weakly in hymns. The sound carried faintly over the ruined buildings, a fragile defiance in the cold. That Christmas, there were no feasts, no warm fires, no gifts, only hunger, cold, and the knowledge that they still endured. Relief did not come immediately. It was days yet before Patton's army, pivoting from the south, began to break through the German lines. His tanks and infantry pushed through snow and mud, battling every step. When at last they reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the defenders had been holding for a week, cut off, battered but unbroken, the sight of American armor rolling in lifted spirits like nothing else. The siege was broken, but the memory of it would never fade. Bastogne became a symbol, a small town turned giant of defiance. Its name echoed far beyond the Ardennes, carried across radios and newspapers. The world heard of the siege, of the hunger, of the word nuts, and it became legend. In the broader war, it was a single battle, part of a much larger struggle. But to those who fought there, it was everything. Every frozen night, every desperate firefight, every moment of doubt and courage. The story of Bastogne is not just about soldiers, it is about willpower, about ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances, refusing to yield when all logic said they should. It is about the power of defiance, even when surrounded by darkness. In the end, Bastogne was not conquered. It was never surrendered. It stood through hunger, through cold, through endless fire. It stood because men and women within it chose to stand, and in standing they turned a small town into a legend. The Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, but in the heart of it all, Bastogne became its symbol, a frozen fortress, a town that held the line when everything else seemed ready to fall. And in that winter, against tanks and artillery, against hunger and despair, the courage of a few wrote a story that still echoes today. The roads of the Ardennes groaned under the weight of machines. Tanks crawled through ice-crusted tracks, their engines coughing and growling as if every mile might be their last. Exhaust clouds poured into frozen air, curling like smoke from some endless furnace. Steel met snow, treads crunching and grinding, leaving scars across the countryside. Soldiers walked alongside, their boots slipping, rifles slung low, eyes red from sleepless nights. War had come to these woods before, but never like this. The German offensive surged forward, and with it came the heart of their gamble: speed. Hitler had demanded a lightning strike through the Ardennes, a drive to the Meuse, and beyond to Antwerp. But speed was fragile in December. Every tank strained against frost. Every vehicle coughed out precious fuel it barely had, and every road became a battlefield of its own. The Battle of Saint-Vith was one of those roads. A small Belgian town, little known outside its valley, suddenly became a cornerstone. For the Germans, it was a gateway west. For the Americans, it was a wall that could not fall. Troops of the 7th Armored Division, along with infantry and engineers, dug in against wave after wave. Snow fell, shells screamed, and yet the defense held. Day after day, Saint-Vith became a thorn in the German timetable. Instead of racing forward, their columns stalled. Bridges that should have carried tanks crumbled under fire. Crossroads that should have been open became killing grounds. The defenders of Saint-Vith did not have the numbers, did not have the luxury of retreat, but they had time, and time itself became their weapon. Every delay bled the German advance. Maps that had been marked with neat arrows pointing west grew meaningless as those arrows froze in place. Tanks bogged down in mud and snow, fuel lines stretched thin, orders became desperate. Saint-Vith, stubborn and battered, bought days that the Allies used to regroup, to reposition, to prepare. The German gamble, already fragile, began to falter. But the cost was heavy. Bridges were fought over not once, but 3, 4 times. Men crossed rivers under fire, water running red as ice cracked beneath their boots. Crossroads turned into graveyards, littered with burned-out vehicles, frozen bodies stiff in the snow. The air stank of cordite, smoke, and the sickly sweet smell of blood. Every inch of ground around Saint-Vith was written over in lives. And beyond the smoke of battle, darker shadows stretched. At Malmedy, on December 17th, cruelty revealed itself in the starkest of forms. American prisoners of war, more than 80 men, were herded into a snow-covered field by SS troops of Kampfgruppe Piper. They were unarmed, defenseless, expecting perhaps captivity, perhaps transport to the rear. What they received was murder. Machine guns opened up, the snow erupting with blood and cries. Men fell in heaps, some instantly, others crawling, moaning, gasping in the frozen air. A few feigned death beneath the bodies of their comrades, waiting, praying, hoping to escape when the killers left. The Malmedy massacre was not the only atrocity of that offensive, but it became its darkest emblem. It was cruelty etched into snow, a reminder that beneath uniforms and orders lay choices, and those choices could descend into horror. Survivors stumbled away later, wounded, frostbitten, carrying the memory with them like a brand. News of the massacre spread quickly among American troops. Any illusion that this was just another battle evaporated. This was no game of maneuver. This was war in its coldest, ugliest form. And yet the battle raged on. The fields around Malmedy saw more fighting, more blood spilled into the snow. German columns tried to press west. American units scrambled to slow them. Villages were shelled to rubble, their stone walls collapsing under fire. Civilians fled when they could, or hid in cellars when they could not. The forests, once quiet, filled with the thunder of artillery and the shriek of dying men. Everywhere, shadows lengthened. Tank crews lived in a world of fire and frost, their turrets iced over, their breath fogging the cramped interiors. Infantry hugged the ground, crawling through snow, using wrecked vehicles as cover. Engineers wired bridges with explosives, ready to blow them rather than let the enemy cross. And always, above it all, the cold pressed down, a merciless ally of no one. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears. Men who survived gunfire sometimes lost to the weather. Blankets were scarce, fires forbidden, and the night brought with it silence, broken only by the groan of distant engines. Saint-Vith eventually fell, but not quickly, not cleanly. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans, taking so long, costing so much, that it poisoned the larger plan. Every day spent hammering at that small town was another day lost in the grand design. The stubborn defense turned what might have been a swift advance into a grinding crawl, and as the German columns slowed, Allied reinforcements gathered. The window of opportunity, narrowed to begin with, shrank further. The Ardennes became a graveyard for ambition. Tanks that should have rolled triumphantly west instead froze in ditches out of fuel, their crews huddling in desperation. Trucks meant to carry supplies burned on roadsides strafed from the air. Fields that once grew crops became littered with steel carcasses, their blackened hulks jutting out of the snow like bones. The soldiers who lived through it carried the images with them forever. The snow was not pure white. It was stained, trampled, churned into mud and gore. The trees were not silent. They were shattered, splintered, stripped bare by shell fire. The nights were not peaceful. They were haunted by the cries of the wounded, the distant rumble of tanks, the whispered prayers of men who knew they might not see morning. And in the midst of it all, the Malmedy massacre lingered like a wound that could not heal. It was spoken of in hushed voices around campfires, in furious vows whispered through clenched teeth. It hardened the resolve of many. For them, surrender was no longer an option. If capture meant slaughter, then fighting to the last bullet became not just bravery, but necessity. The massacre turned snow into testimony that war was not just lines on a map, but cruelty written on the bodies of the helpless. By the end of December, the German push had lost its edge. The initial surprise had bled away. The tanks that once roared forward now sputtered, hungry for fuel that never arrived. The infantry that once marched with confidence now stumbled, exhausted, their boots worn, their morale shaken. The Ardennes, which had seemed like a path to victory, became instead a trap. The forest closed in, the snow deepened, and the shadows grew longer. The men who had fought at Saint-Vite, who had endured Malmedy, who had held bridges and crossroads against all odds, knew they had bent but not broken. They had watched comrades fall, they had walked past frozen bodies in ditches, they had smelled death on the wind, but they also knew something else. The German gamble was slipping away. In that winter landscape of steel and snow, death was constant. It lay in the open fields, stiff in the drifts, hidden in shattered barns. It rode on the backs of tanks and whispered through the forests. And yet, within that same landscape, defiance burned. The defense of Saint-Vite, the stubborn holding of crossroads, the memory of Malmedy, these became part of the greater story, not one of swift conquest, but of resistance, not one of triumph for the aggressor, but of endurance for the defender. The Ardennes in December was not just a battlefield. It was a canvas where war painted its most haunting picture. Steel grinding against frost, blood freezing into snow, shadows stretching over men who fought, who killed, who died, who endured. And when the echoes finally faded, what remained was not glory, not grandeur, but silence, the silence of a forest scarred forever by war. The winter sky pressed down like a heavy blanket, thick with fog, swollen with low clouds muffling the sound of the earth below. It was December in the Ardennes, and for days the heavens seemed sealed shut. Allied planes sat grounded, rows of bombers waiting like chained beasts, fighters lined up on icy runways, engines silent. The airmen stared upward at a ceiling of gray, knowing that the battle raged just miles away, but out of their reach. They could hear the news filtering in, German armor breaking through, towns falling, units retreating, and all they could do was wait. The weather was the Germans' greatest ally in those first days. Their offensive had been planned with precision, timed to the season, counted upon the cover of winter's shroud. The Luftwaffe no longer dominated the skies. The Allies, with their bombers and fighters, ruled the air when they could fly. But in December of 1944, the clouds hid everything. Fog rolled across the valleys. Snow flurries blurred vision. The great power of Allied air superiority was smothered, buried beneath the weather. And in that pause, the German columns moved. Tanks crept along narrow Ardennes roads, stretching into endless convoys. They looked like steel serpents crawling through the forest, snaking across frozen hills, headlights covered in slits of paper to hide their glow. Trucks groaned with supplies, ammunition, rations, fuel that was worth more than gold. Men marched beside them, boots crunching on ice, breath misting, their bodies stiff from cold and exhaustion. Horses pulled wagons where engines failed, wheels squealing in the snow. It was a movement of desperation, of ambition, of last reserves poured into one gamble. To the soldiers huddled in foxholes along the American lines, the fog was both curse and cloak. They could hear the rumble of engines in the distance, feel the ground tremble as armor advanced, but the mist hid everything. Shadows loomed and disappeared. The sound of a tank could be anywhere 100 yards away or a mile. Machine gun nests strained their ears for the clatter of treads, but often all they heard was silence, followed by sudden thunder when shells crashed through the haze. Visibility was measured in feet, sometimes inches. Battles became blind struggles, fought in white swirls and half-seen figures. For the Allies, every day the weather stayed low was a day of dread. Commanders knew that their advantage in the air was being denied. Patton's men, Montgomery's forces, the scattered American divisions along the line, they were fighting without the eye in the sky that had carried them this far across Europe. Supply depots could not be protected. German columns could not be harassed from above. Every gun, every tank, every soldier had to bear the full brunt without relief from the bombers that usually softened the blow. For the Germans, the fog was hope. It wrapped around their ambitions like a shield, allowing them to surge deeper into enemy lines than they should have been able to. Without planes to spot them, their armored spearheads could mass and thrust through weak points. Without strafing fighters overhead, their convoys could stretch for miles without being shredded from above. It was as if the Ardennes itself conspired to hide them, trees and clouds working in unison to grant them precious hours of movement. But weather is never permanent. The clouds that seemed eternal began to shift. Slowly, over days, the skies grew restless. Winds picked up, pushing the fog, tearing holes in the cover. On December 23rd, the change came. The ceiling lifted, the clouds broke. The winter veil that had hidden the battlefield began to dissolve. For the first time since the offensive began, sunlight pierced the Ardennes, and with that sunlight came wings. The roar of engines shattered the quiet. Bombers rose in formation, silver bodies gleaming against the pale sky. Fighters screamed ahead, diving, climbing, sweeping over forests and valleys. The airfields that had been hushed for days exploded into life. The ground crews working frantically, loading bombs, fueling tanks, pushing planes into place. Pilots who had waited with restless energy finally took to the air, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the white landscape below. For the German columns, it was a nightmare unveiled. Those steel serpents that had once crawled unseen were now exposed, their long tails stretched out on narrow roads with no cover. Convoys that had moved confidently under fog suddenly found themselves trapped in the open. From above, they were targets, clear as ink on paper. Bombs fell like thunderbolts. The ground shook as whole vehicles were lifted and torn apart. Trucks burst into flame, their loads of fuel erupting into fireballs that licked across the snow. Tanks were smashed, treads ripped away, turrets hurled into the air. Fighters swept low, their guns chattering, tearing into convoys, ripping apart stragglers. Bridges were struck, collapsing into rivers, cutting off retreat or advance. Roads became blocked by wreckage, snarled with burning metal. Men scattered, diving into ditches, scrambling for cover that no longer existed. Horses bolted wagons overturned. The same fog that had once shielded them was gone, and in its place was merciless clarity. The Americans on the ground looked upward and cheered. They had endured days of relentless pressure, nights filled with the sound of advancing armor, mornings filled with uncertainty. Now the sky had chosen a side. Supplies could finally be dropped to encircled units. Pilots radioed coordinates, guiding artillery with precision. The trapped 101st Airborne in Bastogne heard the engines overhead and knew they were not forgotten. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies parachuted into their lines, drifting down like gifts from heaven. For the Germans, every mile grew harder. Fuel that had once been carried forward now burned on shattered roads. Every attempt to resupply was met with air attack. Every move in daylight was a risk of annihilation. Their timetable, already fractured by the stubborn defenses at Saint-Vith and Bastogne, now collapsed further. The push toward the Meuse faltered, slowed, then stopped. The weather had turned the tide. Yet the story was not only of bombs and bullets. It was of men watching the sky and knowing it had betrayed them. German officers cursed the sun. They had hoped for days, even weeks of cover. But fate gave them less than one. Soldiers who had trudged through snow for miles now lay broken beside burning tanks. Commanders who had drawn straight arrows on maps now stared at roads blocked with wreckage, plans turned to ash. The air had chosen its allegiance, and it was not with them. The Ardennes echoed with this change. The silence of fog gave way to the constant hum of engines, the whistle of bombs, the thunder of explosions. What had been a hidden war of shadows became an open storm. Forests burned, villages shattered, snow turned black with soot and red with blood. The Allied advance, once hesitant, grew bolder. Troops pushed forward under the shield of their planes, knowing the skies above were theirs once again. And in that shift lay the fate of the offensive. Without fuel, without supply, without the ability to move unseen, the German army lost the edge. Their gamble had always been fragile. It depended on speed, secrecy, and surprise. The weather had given them those gifts for a brief moment, but when the clouds lifted, the gifts were gone, and all that remained was the reality of a war they could not win. The men who survived remembered it clearly. The fog, the stillness, the eerie quiet of days when the sky seemed to hold its breath. Then the sudden explosion of noise, the roar of engines, the fire raining down. They remembered watching convoys destroyed in minutes, bridges collapsing, comrades fleeing in panic. They remembered supplies finally reaching their frozen foxholes, lifelines carried by parachutes against a blue sky. They remembered above all that the battle's turning point was not just men against men or tank against tank, but weather itself. The Ardennes in December was a place where the earth and sky decided the fate of armies. Ice below, air above. For days the balance leaned one way, cloaked in fog. Then with a shift of wind and a break of clouds it leaned the other. The turning of the battle was not written in strategy alone, but in the clouds, the sun, the endless reach of wings. And when the skies finally cleared for good, the outcome was inevitable. The Reich's last gamble was unraveling, exposed beneath the open heavens, crushed beneath the weight of bombs, strafing fire, and a resurgent enemy. The Ardennes, once shielded by fog, became a killing ground under a pitiless sky. The men on both sides understood it then. Weather had chosen a side, and with that choice, the story of the Bulge was no longer a question of if, but of when. The Ardennes lay frozen, a battlefield wrapped in silence and fire. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne stood surrounded, cut off, their lines pressed from every side. Hunger gnawed, frost bit, ammunition dwindled. Yet they held. They held when logic said surrender. They held when the artillery shook the earth, when tanks circled them like wolves, when the sky brought little but clouds and smoke. Bastogne became more than a town. It was a symbol, a fortress of defiance carved out of snow and blood. But even symbols cannot last forever without relief. Relief would come from the south, where a general named George S. Patton was preparing to move heaven and earth. Patton, brash and relentless, had already carved his reputation in North Africa, Sicily, and France. He was a man who saw war not as hesitation but as motion, constant, furious, overwhelming motion. And now, when the Ardennes crisis struck, he turned his army like a wheel, pivoting an entire corps northward in a maneuver that defied expectation. In days, not weeks, his men would cover ground that seemed impossible. It was a march through winter's worst, a race against time itself. The roads were treacherous, coated in ice, clogged with snow. Vehicles slid, wheels spinning, engines coughing in the bitter cold. Tanks churned forward, their treads clanking, chewing through mud and frost. Columns stretched for miles, endless chains of men and machines grinding forward, their breath freezing in the air, their bodies hunched against the wind. Every mile cost sweat and strength. Every mile was a victory over the elements. Patton's soldiers trudged alongside their machines, their faces hidden by scarves, their hands stiff in frozen gloves. They slept in brief snatches, curled against engines for warmth, eating rations that turned to blocks of ice in their hands. Yet they kept moving. The orders were clear. Bastogne must not fall. The men holding that town were brothers in arms, paratroopers who had bled in Normandy, who had jumped into Holland, who now stood as a wall against the German tide. To let them be crushed was unthinkable. Relief was not just strategy, it was duty. The march north became a legend in itself. Columns of tanks and trucks wound through villages where civilians stood silently, watching the endless chain of steel pass by. Some offered bread, coffee, or prayers. Others simply stared, their homes already scarred by war, wondering if salvation truly rode with these men. The soldiers had little time to notice. Their world had narrowed to the road ahead, the next frozen step, the next sputtering engine that needed coaxing back to life. Snow fell relentlessly, muting the world into white and gray. Boots crunched, chains clattered, engines roared, and yet the silence of the Ardennes still pressed down. At night the sky glowed faintly with distant fires. Flares lit the horizon where Bastogne's defenders still fought. The men marching north saw those lights and knew that was where they were needed. That was where history waited for them. Patton himself drove his men with ruthless urgency. He demanded speed, demanded effort beyond exhaustion, demanded what seemed impossible. He inspired and infuriated, cursed and praised, but above all he moved them. The pivot northward was his gamble, a decision taken against doubts and obstacles. Other generals doubted the feasibility of such a maneuver. Roads were clogged, weather was merciless, the enemy was strong, but Patton refused hesitation. To him, obstacles were not excuses but challenges. And so the Third Army moved like a storm unleashed. Armored divisions plowed forward, artillery units dragged their guns into position, infantry trudged mile after mile through snow and mud. Bridges were crossed under fire, roads cleared under bombardment, fields churned into mire beneath thousands of boots and treads. Men collapsed from fatigue, rose again, pushed on. The march became more than movement. It became a test of will. As they pressed closer to Bastogne, resistance thickened. German units, already stretched from their offensive, sought to block the relief columns. Skirmishes flared in villages, firefights echoing through frosted streets, and tanks clashed on icy roads, their shells lighting up the night. Each engagement slowed the march but could not stop it. The momentum was too strong. Patton's men pressed on, carving a path through every obstacle. The defenders of Bastogne, meanwhile, endured the unendurable. Surrounded, short of supplies, they shivered in foxholes, their rifles stiff with frost. Medical units worked with dwindling morphine, patching wounds with whatever cloth could be found. Rations were stretched until they were no more than crumbs. Artillery fire rained down day and night, collapsing buildings, shattering nerves. And yet, when the German commander demanded surrender, the answer had been simple, defiant, unforgettable. Nuts! That word echoed through the town like a banner, a promise that Bastogne would not yield. When the skies cleared and supplies began to fall, hope returned. But hope alone could not hold forever. Relief was needed. Every man in Bastogne knew it. Every man in Patton's columns marching north knew it. And so the two forces drew closer, the besieged and the rescuers, bound by urgency, by desperation, by defiance. The clash came at the approaches to Bastogne, where German forces fought to keep the ring closed. Battles erupted in snow-choked fields, where tanks lurched and fired, where infantry crawled through drifts waist-deep, where machine guns rattled until barrels smoked. Patton's men drove forward, their bodies screaming for rest, their spirits hardened by the knowledge that every step brought them closer to their goal. Finally, on December 26th, the relief reached Bastogne. A spearhead of Patton's armored units broke through, their tanks rolling into the battered town. Exhausted paratroopers, haggard and frostbitten, greeted them with weary smiles and cheers. The siege was broken. Bastogne still stood. Its defenders, though worn to the bone, had held long enough. Patton's march had delivered them from annihilation. The moment was not just military. It was emotional, human, profound. Men who had fought in isolation now clasped hands with comrades who had come through hell to reach them. Supplies flowed, medical units tended to the wounded, artillery support joined the battered lines. Bastogne, the symbol of resistance, became also a symbol of relief, of unity, of armies converging in triumph against odds. But the march to Bastogne left scars. Thousands of men had pushed themselves beyond limits, trudged through snow and mud until their bodies ached beyond repair. Vehicles had broken down, burned out, frozen in place. Casualties had fallen along the way, men who would never see the relief they marched to deliver. The price was high, but the outcome could not be denied. The road to Bastogne had been written in sweat, blood, and willpower. Patton's gamble had paid off. His pivot, his relentless push, had rewritten the tale of winter. Where once the German offensive threatened to split the Allies, now it faltered, its momentum broken. Bastogne had not fallen. Instead, it became the anvil upon which the German thrust shattered. The relief of Bastogne turned the tide, giving the Allies not only a victory but a renewed spirit. The bulge in the line had been tested but not broken. In the quiet that followed, the men who had marched, who had fought, who had held, remembered. They remembered the endless columns stretching north, the frozen nights, the bitter fights along the way. They remembered the faces of comrades who had not made it. They remembered the cheers when the first tanks rolled into Bastogne. Memory became legend, and legend became history. The Ardennes still bore the scars tracks carved into frozen fields, villages reduced to rubble, forests shattered by artillery. Yet among those scars lay the story of a march that seemed impossible, of a general's will that bent armies to his command, of a relief that came not a moment too soon. The road to Bastogne was not just a march. It was a race against despair, a collision of exhaustion and determination, a rewriting of winter's tale. It was proof that even in the bleakest cold, with snow and mud marking every step, men could still carve triumph from the edge of disaster. And as the relief column settled into the battered town, as the defenders finally exhaled, one truth rang clear. Bastogne had endured, and because it endured, so too did the hope of victory. The Ardennes had burned for weeks. Snow turned red, forests splintered, villages shattered. At first it was the Germans who surged, striking with fury and precision, their armored columns punching deep into Allied lines, their artillery thundering across the hills. They called it the Great Counter-Offensive, a final gamble, a last desperate bid to change the course of a war already leaning toward its end. For a moment it seemed to work. The Allies reeled. The lines bent. A great bulge tore across the map of Europe, threatening to split armies apart. But gambles are fragile things. They rely on momentum, on fuel, on time. And in the frozen fields of Belgium and Luxembourg, those three lifelines began to run out. The panzer spearheads pushed forward, their tanks growling through narrow forest roads, their infantry trudging behind with rifles slung and hopes high. They dreamed of Antwerp, of cutting off supplies, of breaking the Allied front in two. But every mile carried a hidden cost. The roads were clogged with their own success, endless traffic jams of trucks, guns, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons. The cold chewed at engines, froze oil, cracked metal, and above all there was the fuel. Every panzer needed it, every truck, every half-track, every machine devoured it, and the Reich no longer had it to spare. At first the Germans captured Allied fuel dumps along their path, refueling on the spoils of war. But those dumps grew fewer. The Allies burned what they could not carry, and suddenly the tanks that had roared forward began to sputter, to stall, to sit uselessly in the snow. Panzer commanders cursed the gauges that pointed to empty. Drivers abandoned machines where they stood, engines frozen silent. The great steel fist of the offensive was unclenching, not because of defeat in battle, but because the gas that fed it was gone. The Allies, stunned in the opening days, recovered quickly. Eisenhower and his generals saw the danger, saw the bulge growing, but they also saw opportunity. German columns were extended, their flanks exposed, their supply lines stretched thin over frozen roads, and so the counterattack began. From north and south, from east and west, Allied divisions struck back. American infantry clawed their way into retaken villages, sometimes house by house, room by room. British forces in the north steadied the line, their armor moving to contain the bulge. Patton's Third Army pushed from the south, relentless, the same army that had broken through to Bastogne now pressing further, driving into German-held ground. The fighting was bitter, brutal, close. Villages that had been taken at dawn were retaken by dusk, only to be contested again by midnight. Streets were littered with the wreckage of tanks, twisted hulks frozen in place, their crews lying stiff beside them. Fields once covered in snow became fields of churned mud and blood, artillery craters scarring the earth. The forests were worse, dark, tangled, echoing with gunfire. They swallowed men whole. Soldiers stumbled through snow and shadow, never sure what waited behind the next tree-line, friend, foe, or silence. And yet slowly, steadily, the bulge began to shrink. Every counterattack pressed deeper. Every village retaken was a nail in the coffin of the offensive. The Allies had resources the Germans no longer possessed: fuel, ammunition, replacements, the ability to keep fighting when the enemy was running on fumes. American artillery batteries fired until their barrels glowed red, saturating roads, bridges, and assembly points with fire. When the skies cleared, Allied planes swarmed above, hunting columns trapped on frozen roads, turning convoys into burning wrecks. What had once been the spear point of the Reich became a graveyard of steel. German soldiers fought with desperation. Many knew this was their last chance, their last offensive, their last hope to turn back the tide. They fought hard, clinging to villages, ambushing in forests, holding crossroads with fanatical resolve. But their strength bled away with every day, every shell, every liter of fuel that could not be found. Entire divisions withered, their tanks abandoned, their infantry reduced to scattered groups trudging back east through the snow. The bulge that had once surged forward now sagged inward, collapsing under its own weight. At Bastogne, the relief held, and the Germans withdrew. At Saint-Vite, the stubborn defense that had delayed them now turned into an Allied advance. Along the northern shoulder, British and American forces pressed down, squeezing the bulge from above. The map changed by the hour, German arrows retreating, Allied lines straightening. What had been a bold thrust became a retreat under fire. The Ardennes villages bore the brunt of this ebb and flow. Bastogne's ruins smoked. Malmedy bore the stain of massacre. Houffalize, Laroche, and countless others became names written in rubble. Civilians huddled in cellars, listening to battles rage overhead, watching as one army replaced another, as shells and bombs reduced their homes to kindling. They endured hunger, cold, fear, and the knowledge that their towns had become chess squares in a deadly game. By January, the gamble was over. The bulge that had terrified the Allies, that had shaken confidence, that had seemed for a moment like it might split an army and a continent, had shrunk back to nothing. The line straightened. The offensive faltered. The Reich had bet everything on winter, on surprise, on fuel it did not have, on a dream of dividing enemies stronger than itself. And it lost. For the Germans, the defeat was more than a battlefield failure. It was a wound that would not heal. The armored divisions that had been thrown into the Ardennes could not be replaced. The fuel burned could not be regained. The men lost, the officers killed, the machines abandoned, all of it hollowed out the Wehrmacht, leaving it weakened beyond recovery. The Reich had waged its last reserve of strength, and in the snows of Belgium it had been shattered. For the Allies, the victory was costly but decisive. Tens of thousands of men lay dead or wounded, their bodies frozen in forests, scattered across fields, buried in snow. The winter had been cruel, the fighting savage, the price high, but the line held. The counterattack succeeded, and with the Bulge erased, the path into Germany itself lay open. From this moment forward, the Reich would only retreat. The Ardennes was its last gamble, its last roar. After this, there would be no more surprises, no more offensives, only the slow, grinding march of Allied armies into the heart of the Third Reich. The Ardennes remembered. The forests still bore the scars, trees shattered, earth cratered, villages rebuilt but haunted. The Bulge that had once threatened to break the Allies now stands in memory as the place where the Reich broke itself. Soldiers who had fought there carried the memory forever, the frozen marches, the desperate battles, the exhaustion, the relief, the horror, and the triumph. The Ardennes became a chapter in history written in ice and fire, a story of a gamble taken and lost, of a Bulge that rose and fell, of an army that fought on the edge of despair and found its strength again. And when the snow finally melted, when the fields turned green again, the silence of the forest told the final truth. The Bulge had broken, and with it the last hope of a Reich that could no longer rise. When the guns finally fell silent, when the roar of artillery faded into the forests, and the last of the engines sputtered into stillness, the Ardennes lay in ruin. The battle had passed, but what it left behind was not triumph, not glory, not even the neat order of victory. It left ashes in the snow, villages burned, fields once white and pure now churned into grey mud, pocked with craters and streaked with blood. Forests that had stood for centuries towering and proud stood shattered, their trunks splintered, their branches torn. And among these scars, people, ordinary people, walked in silence, picking through the wreckage of homes and lives, searching for what the storm had left untouched. The soldiers would move on. Armies march forward as they must, chasing the next objective, preparing for the next push. But civilians had no such escape. They were rooted to the land, bound to the soil and the houses that had sheltered their families for generations. When the armies departed, these people remained, staring at broken beams, charred walls, and empty doorframes. Children wandered through streets that no longer resembled streets, only jagged paths between rubble. Old men sat on doorsteps, though the doors behind them were gone. Women picked up pieces of porcelain, fragments of plates that once held family dinners, holding them as if they were relics of a vanished world. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was not written in maps or arrows, not counted in tank brigades or fuel reserves. It was written in the silence of those who had survived. Families were scattered, many never reunited. Homes were reduced to skeletons of stone and timber, their fires extinguished not by warmth, but by shell fire. Churches that had once rung with bells stood hollow, their towers cracked, their stained glass shattered into tiny jewels lost in the snow. Winter is cruel enough on its own. It freezes the air, hardens the soil, slows the rhythm of life. But in this winter of 1944 and 1945, winter became a mourner. It wrapped everything in silence, as if covering the dead with a white shroud. Snow drifted over mass graves, over ruined tanks, over farmhouses whose families would never return. It softened the edges of destruction, but it did not erase it. Beneath the blanket of white lay the scars, waiting for spring to expose them once again. Survivors carried memory like stone. They did not speak of it easily, for words cannot truly hold such weight. But it was in their eyes, in the way they touched the rebuilt walls of their homes, in the way they walked through forests where nothing grew quite straight again. Children grew up remembering nights spent in cellars, huddled against the cold, listening to the earth shake as artillery thundered overhead. They remembered hunger, the taste of rationed bread, the fear etched into their mothers' faces, and they remembered silence, the terrifying silence when the shelling stopped, when no one knew if it meant safety or the approach of something worse. There were moments of kindness amid the ruin. American soldiers who shared chocolate with children, medics who tended not only to their comrades, but to villagers wounded in the crossfire, families who opened their homes, or what remained of them, to strangers, because survival demanded it. And yet kindness was small against the enormity of destruction. The war had carved deep wounds, and no chocolate bar, no whispered prayer, no gesture of humanity could fully heal them. In places like Malmedy, the horror was sharper still. The massacre of prisoners lingered as a stain not only on the snow, but on memory itself. Civilians whispered of it, children overheard, and the forest carried the echo. In other towns, the echoes were of bombings, of fires that swept through wooden homes, of livestock slaughtered in the fields. Survival meant starting again from nothing, with hands cracked by cold and hearts cracked by grief. The fields that had once grown wheat, barley, and rye were torn by tank tracks, churned into lifeless mud. Spring would come, as it always did, but the soil bore scars. Farmers returning to their land found metal instead of seed, fragments of shrapnel instead of sprouts. Some plowed and planted anyway because hunger left no other choice. Others simply stared at their ruined fields, wondering how to begin again. For many civilians, displacement was the cruelest wound. Families walked with carts, carrying what little they had salvaged, blankets, a pot, a few photographs. Some left forever, resettling in safer towns, carrying only memory of the villages that no longer stood. Others stayed, rebuilding stone by stone, beam by beam, even when it seemed impossible. The Ardennes became a place of ruins and of resilience, its people refusing to let winter's silence be the final word. The war would end within months. The Allies would cross the Rhine, Germany itself would fall, the Reich would crumble. Newspapers would announce victory, parades would follow, new flags would fly. But for those who had lived through the Bulge, victory was not celebration. It was survival. It was waking each morning to a landscape of ashes and deciding somehow to go on. History books tally numbers. 89,000 American casualties, 100,000 German losses. Civilians killed, villages destroyed, churches leveled. But numbers blur. They grow distant. What mattered to those who lived it were the faces. The empty chair at the table, the child who did not return from playing outside, the husband taken away to fight, who never came home, the neighbor whose house was flattened, whose family vanished. War leaves numbers for historians, but it leaves empty spaces for everyone else. The Ardennes itself became witness. Trees regrew, but in strange shapes, bent and twisted where shrapnel had torn them. Streams ran clear, but beneath the water lay rusting helmets and broken rifles. Fields greened, but farmers' plows still struck metal buried deep. The land remembered, carrying the scars even when men tried to forget. And when the wind blew in winter, it carried whispers, faint, but there. Whispers of fire, of screams, of silence. The forest was no longer only forest. It was memory. Generations after the battle, children walked the same roads. They played in the same meadows. They ran through the same forests. And sometimes they stumbled on relics, a shell casing, a buckle, a rusted piece of machinery. They brought them home, their parents frowning, their grandparents falling silent. The objects were not toys. They were reminders. Ashes left behind in the snow. Survivors grew old. Many spoke of rebuilding, of moving forward, of finding peace in the ordinary rhythms of farming, of tending shops, of raising families. But some never spoke of the battle at all. The silence became its own monument, as heavy as stone. For those who did share their memories, their words carried weight. They spoke of hunger, of fear, of the smell of smoke that clung to everything. They spoke of nights where the only light came from fires on the horizon. They spoke of snow falling gently, soundlessly, even as battles raged, as if winter itself refused to take sides, content only to cover the living and the dead alike. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was hidden beneath strategy, beneath the arrows of generals' maps. The official histories spoke of armored thrusts, of divisions committed, of counterattacks and withdrawals. But the true story was in the ashes left behind. It was in the cracked hands of a woman rebuilding her house stone by stone. It was in the hollow stare of a child who had seen too much. It was in the weary sigh of an old man who remembered fields before they were torn apart by tanks. In the end, winter itself became both witness and mourner. The snow fell softly on graves, covering friend and foe alike. It blanketed ruins, muffling their sharp edges. It silenced the echoes of war, at least for a time. And in that silence, memory took root. Not in maps, not in strategies, but in the hearts of those who had lived it, and in the land that could never truly forget. Ashes in the snow, that was the legacy of the Ardennes. Not only a battle of tanks and soldiers, but a battle that consumed villages, tore families apart, and scarred a landscape for generations. It was war stripped of glory, leaving behind only ruin, memory, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to vanish. And when the last survivors are gone, when the last voices fall silent, the land itself will remain, holding the memory in its forests, its fields, and its winter silence. The Ardennes will remember. Always. The Ardennes grew quiet again. The great roar of the counter-offensive, the endless thunder of artillery, the cries of men and the growl of tanks, all faded into silence. What had begun as Hitler's final gamble ended in retreat, in exhaustion, in failure. The last gasp of Nazi ambition had come and gone, leaving only echoes behind. For Germany, the dream of splitting the Allied armies, of reaching Antwerp, of turning the tide of the war, it was gone. The Reich had thrown its last strength into the snows of Belgium and Luxembourg, and the snows had swallowed it whole. The panzers that had once rumbled forward stood abandoned, engines silent, steel carcasses rusting beneath drifts of white. Soldiers who had marched with fire in their eyes now trudged eastward, beaten, hungry, broken. Some did not march at all. They lay beneath the snow, where the winter itself became their shroud. Hitler's last gamble had cost him dearly. Entire divisions had been spent. Entire armies bled out. The Reich could not replace them. Factories lay in ruins, fuel was gone, and the men left to fight were boys and old men. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a defeat. It was the breaking of the last fragile hope the Reich still carried. For the Allies, it was a victory, but one paid in frost and blood. The lines had held, but only just. The soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes carried with them memories that would never leave. Nights spent freezing in foxholes, rifles so cold they stuck to bare skin, the sound of shells raining down in endless barrages. They remembered Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held out against all odds. They remembered the frozen roads where tanks bogged down and men collapsed from exhaustion. They remembered the faces of comrades who never rose again from the snow. The victory was costly. Almost 90,000 American casualties, tens of thousands more on the British side. The numbers climbed higher still when one counted the civilians, families displaced, villages destroyed, children orphaned. And the Germans too had paid a terrible price. 100,000 men lost, entire armored divisions shattered, the last reserves of the Reich scattered like ashes. The victory cleared the way to the Rhine, opened the door into Germany itself, but it came at a price so steep that even in triumph the taste was bitter. And yet, it was decisive. After the Ardennes, there would be no more great offensives from Germany, no more surprises, no more bold thrusts into Allied lines. The Reich was finished, even if it did not yet know it. From this moment on, the war in the West would be a steady march into Germany, across the Rhine, to the Elbe, and finally, to Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge was the last breath of a dying empire, and when it ended, only surrender remained. But battles do not end only with armies. They linger in places, in people, in memory. The Ardennes itself became a monument. Forests scarred by shell fire, villages rebuilt from rubble, cemeteries where rows upon rows of white crosses marked the resting places of the fallen. In Bastogne, a star-shaped memorial rose, honoring the soldiers who had stood firm in the freezing dark. In Luxembourg, in Belgium, in France, countless cemeteries stretched across quiet fields, their silence heavier than any words. Each cross, each star, each name carved in stone was a reminder of the price paid in that winter of 1944. Visitors came in the years that followed. Veterans returned to the forests where they had once fought, walking among the trees, touching the bark, remembering nights when the woods had been filled with fire. They stood before the graves of their friends, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears, sometimes in words spoken to the air. Civilians rebuilt their towns, but never forgot. They told their children stories of the winter when the earth shook, when armies clashed in their streets, when survival itself was uncertain. The Ardennes became a place of both mourning and resilience, where ruin had given way to rebuilding, but where memory always lingered. And the echoes traveled further still. In history books, the battle became legend. In classrooms, students learned of Bastogne, of Patton's Drive, of the fog that grounded plains, of the skies that cleared and turned the tide. In documentaries, black and white footage showed tanks crawling through snow, soldiers marching with rifles slung, generals studying maps marked with arrows. But the real echoes were not in books or films. They were in the silence of forests, in the stones of monuments, in the hearts of those who had lived it. The Battle of the Bulge was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of German ambition in the West, the end of the Reich's ability to strike back with force. It was the beginning of the Allies' final push into Germany, the road that would lead to the Rhine, the Elbe, and ultimately to victory. But it was also a beginning of memory, a memory that would outlast the war, outlast the men who fought it, outlast even the ruins themselves. It was called the last great battle of the Western Front, but it was more than that. It was a test of endurance, of resilience, of will. It was fought not only by generals and armies, but by ordinary men in foxholes, by villagers hiding in cellars, by families waiting for news that might never come. It was a battle where winter itself seemed to take sides, first shielding the German advance with fog, then granting the Allies the clear skies they needed to strike back. It was a battle where cruelty showed its face in massacres and where courage was carved into legend in the defense of Bastogne. And when it ended, the echoes remained. The forest remembered, the rivers remembered, the villages remembered, and so too did the people, carrying memory like stone, heavy but unshakable. For them, the Ardennes was not just history, it was life, loss, survival. It was the sound of artillery in the night, it was the sight of tanks burning in the snow, it was the feeling of hunger, of cold, of fear, and it was the relief when at last the guns fell silent. In time, the world moved on. The war ended, nations rebuilt, Europe healed, but the echoes of the Ardennes never vanished. They whispered in winter winds, in the quiet of cemeteries, in the stories passed down through generations. They reminded the world that even in victory, war is not glory, it is sacrifice, it is suffering. It is lives ended too soon and futures never lived. The Battle of the Bulge stands now as a reminder of ambition's futility, of resilience's strength, of memory's endurance. It was the war's final winter lullaby, a song of frost and fire, of courage and despair, of endings and beginnings. And though the men who fought it have grown old and passed away, though the forests have regrown and the villages have rebuilt, the lullaby still plays, softly, quietly, in the Ardennes, in the snow, in the silence. For history never truly ends. It lingers, it echoes, it waits, and the Ardennes, scarred and sacred, will always carry those echoes. The last gasp of Nazi ambition, the victory paid in blood and frost. The road to the Rhine, costly and hard, the monuments, the cemeteries, the forests, and the lullaby of winter reminding us all of what was lost and what was won. The echoes of the Ardennes will never fade. They are written into the earth, into the stone, into the snow, and as long as winter falls across those forests, as long as silence blankets the land, the memory will remain.